Okay, today we're going to look at evaluating idealism. So this is going to be looking at the sort of thing that you would want to do in 25-mark essay questions. I'm going to assume quite a lot of familiarity with the theory itself. That was covered on the last PowerPoint. And the focus of this one is really going to be doing what they're looking for in the 25-mark questions, which is weighing up whether the theory is any good, is it convincing, is it successful. So this would mean, in the context of perception, looking at how perhaps simple and straightforward the theory is, and whether in particular it accounts for things like illusions, hallucinations, and this kind of thing. So there's two ways we can go here, roughly. I'm going to go with initially trying to say that Berkeley is correct, and some of the reasons that we might argue he is, and then move on later on to some of the reasons that he's incorrect, and looking at the problems with idealism. So let's start with the first. So in defense of Berkeley, I think you can take maybe 2 or 3 lines here and perhaps argue in favor of what he's saying for idealism. So we could say that idealism is correct, perhaps on the grounds that it explains perceptual variation in a way which maybe direct realism does not. So remember, Berkeley is accepting some of the points of Locke's indirect realism, and he's going to argue that things like perceptual variation mean that what we perceive is in our minds rather than the objects outside of our minds. Secondly, we could use Occam's Razor and perhaps say that it's a simpler theory than indirect realism, as it eliminates the issue of the veil of perception and the problem of sense data or ideas resembling physical objects. And we'll see why this is going forwards. Lastly, perhaps we could say that it's more consistent with empiricism. If we assume some of the things that Locke has argued for are correct, then perhaps Berkeley's theory is a more straightforward empiricist account of perception than what Locke is actually giving us. So how could we do this? So let's take the first point here. This isn't something that I emphasized much in the previous PowerPoint, but it is something which is important to Berkeley's position. He's not a direct realist, and he comes straight out in his dialogues by saying that we can't be seeing objects which are mind independent because of some of the reasons that Locke goes through as well. So he starts out by showing that our perceptions of things vary. This for him proves, as it does for Locke, that our perceptions are things in our minds rather than existing outside of our minds. We're not perceiving material objects in the external world, we're perceiving ideas which are dependent on our minds. They're something within our own minds. So he uses some of the examples that Locke uses here. He repeats the example of placing a hot and a cold hand in a bowl of tepid water, so water which is neither particularly hot nor cold. The water feels hot to the cold hand and cold to the hot hand, but the water cannot be both hot and cold, which shows that the variation there is to do with what's in our mind's perception of the water rather than the water itself. He also uses the example of clouds, and he says a cloud from a distance perhaps looks pink, but up close it loses its colour or appears maybe grey. And also he gives the example of a solid physical object viewed through a microscope appears to have different colours than those when it's viewed normally. So he's arguing that properties like warmth or colour are mind-dependent appearances, ideas, not properties of mind-independent physical objects. And he then uses this to go beyond what Locke argues and says that actually this variation in an object's properties applies to all of their properties. So it applies equally to things like shape and size, things that Locke believed were primary qualities or mind-independent qualities. Berkeley wants to say that this shows that actually there's no such thing as a mind-independent quality. All of the properties of objects are mind-dependent. And he uses the example of, for instance, size. What appears large to a flea appears small to an elephant. So size is not mind independent. It depends on people's minds. It depends on the mind of the perceiver. So all of the properties of objects are mind dependent. They all are properties in our minds rather than properties that exist outside of our minds. This is enough for Berkeley to disprove direct realism, and on the last point also indirect realism. Secondly, we could argue then that Berkeley is correct because of Occam's Razor. So let's just be clear on what the principle says. This is often oversimplified, and we need to be careful in saying what the principle actually is. So Occam's Razor states that we should not put forward a hypothesis that says many different things exist when a simpler explanation will do as well. Technically, do not multiply entities or things or objects beyond necessity. So a simpler explanation is a better explanation as long as it's just as successful. So it still needs to explain the phenomena that you're talking about, but if it can do that more simply without as many objects or parts in the theory, then the better theory is the simpler one, as long as it does the explanation. So idealism here we could say is ontologically economical. It's economical or simple in terms of what it puts forward as existing. So ontology, remember, is the study of existence. It's ontologically economical with reference to one quality. So everything is a mental or mind-dependent quality rather than the dual qualities of mind and matter put forward or posited in other theories like indirect realism. So remember, it's cutting out the mind-independent world, and it's saying that only minds and ideas exist. This is a simpler theory, and perhaps a more elegant one if we're arguing for Berkeley here. So specifically, he's cutting out then a reference, any reference to a world of material objects which exist beyond our perceptions, and the issue of how our perceptions would give us information on what the material world is like. That was an issue, remember, for Locke. That was what we called the veil of perception problem. So something existing beyond our minds. If all we ever experience is in our minds, how do we get knowledge of that? Well, for Berkeley, that problem simply doesn't arise because the only things that exist are your minds and the perceptions that we have here. So this is a simpler theory, it's ontologically economical, and perhaps this is a better theory for that reason. And finally, we could defend Berkeley on the grounds of his empiricism. So Locke also was an empiricist, but perhaps Berkeley's theory is more consistent with empiricism than Locke's theory for reasons that we can spell out here. So empiricism, remember, states that experience is what gives us knowledge of what exists. However, we've seen that experience only presents us with mind-dependent ideas or sense data. If what we're perceiving is in our minds, as both Locke and Berkeley argue, then how do we have any knowledge of what's beyond those ideas or perceptions? The idea of mind-independent matter, this is something which is literally unintelligible, it's unimaginable or inconceivable, according to Berkeley, because it would exist beyond our immediate perceptions, so it cannot enter our minds as an idea. This was what he was saying, remember, in the master argument, that there's no such possibility of a mind-independent existence, because the only things that we can ever imagine or conceive of are in our minds. So mind for Berkeley is a better explanation of the regularity in our perceptions of objects. Not just our own minds, however, we can't control our perceptions. So remember, Berkeley is offering the mind of God as the cause of our perceptions, and this, according to him, is a much more straightforward explanation of how our perceptions occur. So if ideas are all we experience, they can only be compared to other ideas. This was what we talked about with the likeness principle. So it follows that all that exists are minds and ideas for Berkeley. So perhaps again this is more consistent with empiricism than Locke, who believes that reality is fundamentally unexperienceable. And Berkeley is saying, well, surely that doesn't make any sense. If what we experience are ideas or in our minds, then why even talk about something beyond our minds? Okay, so we've given some arguments to say that perhaps Berkeley is correct. We've talked about him being a more consistent empiricist than Locke, perhaps avoiding some of the problems that Locke faces with his indirect realism. But now we want to look at the case against Berkeley. If you wanted to argue that idealism is not correct or not convincing, what sort of things could we use to say that actually he's wrong about what he says here? Well, I think there's again a few options we could go with, and it's up to you to prioritize these and say, okay, well, this is the most important one for this reason, and that's the kind of line that you want to take in essays here. So one thing that we could perhaps point to is the fact that he fails arguably to account for illusions and hallucinations. Secondly, perhaps we could actually use Occam's Razor to say that he's not giving us a particularly convincing theory because of his introduction of God into the theory to explain our perceptions. So we could think about Occam's Razor in a different way here, and I'll say more about that in a second. And thirdly, we could say, well, while it avoids the problems with indirect realism, a more consistent and believable theory of perception is perhaps direct realism. And there's perhaps ways of arguing against idealism, going back to our initial sort of more common sense theory here. Okay, so to take the first issue then, the issue of illusions and hallucinations, or what we called non-veridical perceptions, so perceptions that don't match up with how the world really is. Why might this be an issue for Berkeley? Well, when we saw the case of the stick in the water, we addressed this with the previous PowerPoint. If all we perceive is our own mind-dependent ideas or sense data, then arguably it becomes impossible to distinguish false perceptions from true ones, because remember, for Berkeley, there is nothing outside of those mind-dependent ideas or sense data. So if we perceive a crooked stick in the water, then it really is crooked because there is no difference between the appearance to us and some real stick in the external world. There is no material object beyond our perception for Berkeley, remember. So there is nothing to say, well, my perception is one thing, but the real external object is something else. Berkeley cannot make that distinction. So in his three dialogues, he replies that our mistake here is to assume or infer that once taken out of the water, the stick will still be crooked or bent. He wants to say that our mistake is with our assumption or our inference that it will be bent once taken out of the water, and not our perception in the moment. But this has this absurd conclusion that it implies that when we see the stick in the water, it really is crooked, and it just changes when we take it out. Now that just seems absurd. He seems to be trying to hang on to his theory here by saying, well, actually your perceptions are correct, but it's your inference or your assumption about what's going to happen in future that is mistaken. If you think the stick is going to be taken out of the water and still be bent, that's your mistake. But he's seemingly hanging on to the view that actually your perception of the crooked stick in the water is correct, which just seems wrong. So perhaps this is a failing of the theory. Secondly, then, the problem of God. You might be saying at this point, well, hang on, haven't we just tried to defend Berkeley's idealism using Occam's Razor? And we did, but remember, Occam's Razor was trying to say that the simplest explanation is the best as long as it explains the thing that we're talking about in an economical and straightforward way. Now, perhaps we could turn this against Berkeley and say, well, maybe after all it's not so straightforward and not so simple, because he's introducing God in a way which is problematic here. So for Berkeley, there are two possible explanations of the regularity and consistency of our ideas. Why is college the same every time we go into it? Why is our bedroom organized in the same way each time, we go into the bedroom? Well, there's two explanations of this. It's because of either the bedroom or college existing in a mind-independent way. It's really there, even if no one's around to perceive it. Or these consistencies are explained by an eternal and omnipresent mind. The idea of God determining our perceptions. Now, he thinks that he's shown that mind-independent matter cannot exist on the basis of the master argument. It shows that matter is contradictory. It's unimaginable to imagine something not being perceived yet existing. So he's going to say that that is impossible. So the best explanation is a greater mind than ours to guarantee the consistency of everything. In other words, the mind of God. But in one straightforward way, we could just say, well, we have no experience of God. And we are arguably better able to make sense of a finite, limited world of material objects existing in space and time than an infinite and eternal mind. Actually, it's much more straightforward, in other words, to argue that the material world existing in space and time as we do, as physical material beings, rather than to think of us as some sort of disembodied mind existing in a way which is very, very different to matter. So, there is also a problem, perhaps, of circularity here. So can Berkeley really use God to guarantee the continued existence of objects when otherwise unperceived, but also use the idea of unperceived change to guarantee the existence of God? So for instance, how do I know that a bath left running didn't cease to exist and reappear full when perceived by me again? Well, for Berkeley, because God was perceiving it in between. But how do I know God exists? Well, maybe he's saying because objects change when unperceived. Now, this seems to be circular. He's assuming what he needs to prove here. So to avoid this, an independent argument for God would be needed, but that's not given here. So actually, what he's doing perhaps is violating Occam's Razor. He's introducing something unnecessary to explain and account for the things that he's trying to explain. And this is a failure, again, of the theory. Finally, then, perhaps we go back to the start. Maybe Berkeley has picked up on some of the problems in indirect realism when actually we shouldn't have accepted Locke's arguments for indirect realism in the first place. Perhaps direct realism is the best account of perception here, and it avoids getting into all of these traps and problems and issues in the first place. So Berkeley dismisses direct realism on the grounds, as we've seen, of perceptual variation, leading him to say that all perceptions are of mind-dependent ideas. However, if we can provide a believable account of variation from a direct realist viewpoint, we avoid the issues of both idealism and indirect realism. So how could we do this? Well, go back to the start and think about what we talked about with relational properties. So the direct realist can appeal to the notion of relational properties to avoid these issues and give a better overall theory of our perceptions. So how does this work? Well, in perceptions, we can be aware of a range of properties, as we saw, some of which the object has independent of our minds, and some of which it has in relation to being perceived. So to go back to the table, perhaps a circular table has the property of looking oval at an angle. But that doesn't mean that I'm seeing something oval in my mind. It just means that the property of looking oval is a distinct property from being oval. So a table can be rectangular and look kind of oval, and that's a very different thing here. So this property of looking oval or elliptical is a relational property. In this case, the property the table has in relation to being seen. So looking oval here is a property that the table has in a particular relation, claims direct realism. It's not the property of ideas or sense data in my mind. So what we're immediately aware of is the physical object. But because of our relation to that physical object, the physical object can look differently at different angles, in different lights, and so on and so on. This doesn't mean that what we're aware of is something kind of in our minds, something mind dependent. It just means that we're aware of the table in a particular relation. So if you go back to illusions, we talked about the stick appearing crooked in relation to the water. The same thing can apply to variation, to all of these problematic cases of perception that generated indirect realism in the first place. So perhaps the best thing to do is to say, well, no, this whole business of seeing something in our minds, that's where it's all gone wrong. Much better to say what we're aware of is the physical object directly, but this can be in different relationships. The person who came up with this idea of relational properties and the kind of relational view of reality gives a further argument, which I'm going to tag on at the end here. And that person was G.E. Moore, someone you'll be familiar with from intuitionism. And he argued in a paper called The Refutation of Idealism in 1903. He argued that Berkeley's idealism fails for one straightforward reason. It does not distinguish, he says, the act of perceiving from the object of perception. So Berkeley argues that as something can only be known by thought, then we cannot know anything outside of thought. So this is the kind of thing Berkeley talked about when he said that an idea can be nothing like nothing but another idea. But this is a mistake, according to Moore, for this reason. So Moore points out that the act-object structure of mental states, so I think would be the act, about an apple would be the object. This leaves a logical gap between the mental state and its object, leaving the possibility open for the object to be mind independent. So the fact that everything that we think of is an object of thought does not, for Moore, entail that everything is mind dependent. So you might think about a tree, but that doesn't mean that the tree is confined to your thoughts. The tree is something which exists in a way independently of your thoughts. And what Berkeley is doing here is kind of collapsing together these two things in a way which is just not logically sound. He's collapsing together the act of thinking and then the object thought about. So Moore wants to reject this distinction and say actually we can talk about being aware of certain things, but then the objects of perception being distinct from that awareness. So that's a final argument to say that perhaps Berkeley is wrong here. Your job when we're looking at these strengths and weaknesses of the theories, however, is to weigh these up, remember, and to try and prioritize. So to take a stance, either he's correct or he's not correct, and then to say which one you think is the most important or most damaging or strongest argument for or against idealism. Some people have argued that actually Berkeley is in this peculiar position of being totally irrefutable. In other words, you can't totally prove him wrong. He's entirely valid in how he argues, but absolutely absurd at the same time. So you could take this sort of middle position perhaps of, well, he's irrefutable but absurd, and that would be one possible way of arguing, kind of in between here. But for the most part you want to try and pick a side and say, okay, well, he's convincing or correct, or he's not convincing and correct, and stick to that and make that the thread of your argument as you go through.